jump into possibly just emotional health. I think the disconnection of us as human beings, the disconnection of ourselves. I'm having Zach Bush at the end of the month on the show talking about cells and cancer, how these cells go out of control because they are disconnected to the rest of the cellular network, the matrix. I think it's the same with human beings. It's never been a time, I think, that we're so disconnected. Good or great friends have decreased significantly. I know there's some studies in the US that from the 80s, the average American used to have 3 really good friends. I think it's down to 1.5 now. So talk about emotional health, being sort of self-aware, self-regulating, social awareness in your relationships, and just a disconnection that's happening, because that would be probably one of the pillars that you would start with regards to someone's health and mental health and emotional health.
Yeah, I don't think you can separate mental health and emotional health. And, one of my favorite quotes is from Carl Jung, who said, all mental illness is the avoidance of a deeper suffering. And what that means is all illness of the mind is a way in which we try and avoid some other pain, some other discomfort. And that usually happens on an emotional level. So if you see thinking as the language of the mind and feeling as the language of the body, thoughts are in the mind, emotions are in the body. So a lot of times we use the mind to avoid the body. We use thinking to avoid feeling. So a lot of times people come to me and say, I'm feeling so much anxiety. And I'll ask them, okay, but what if anxiety is not a feeling? What if anxiety is the avoidance of feeling? Because usually the experience of anxiety, for example, is kind of like the attempt to try and avoid something, the attempt to try and bypass something, or the attempt to try and almost like escape yourself. So all mental health or mental illness, you could say, is the avoidance of some emotion, some grief, some anger, some shame, some fear, something that we don't want to feel will retreat into the mind and almost use mental activity as a way of almost like discharging that energy. We've all heard the term emotion as energy in motion. And when you're feeling your emotions, the energy is in motion. It's being processed. It's being digested, just like food moves through your digestive system. But as soon as we start disconnecting from our emotions, suppressing our emotions, and not feeling our emotions, remember, energy can't be created nor destroyed, only transferred. So that energy has to go somewhere. And it usually goes through the mind, almost like when you shake a soda bottle up, the pressure builds and eventually you pull the cap off and there's a release valve. Mental illness is kind of like the release valve that's a result of the built-up pressure of the emotions that we weren't feeling and processing. And all of that goes back to, the body's unhealthy, the nervous system's overstimulated, but also we're not really taught how to be present with emotions without trying to fix them. We've all been kind of like taught this idea that there's good emotions and there's bad emotions. And you should feel the good emotions and you should avoid the bad emotions. But that creates this pattern and this mechanism of attaching to one polarity and avoiding the other polarity, which creates a lot of suffering. But if you can start to see all emotions as energy moving through your body and drop the label and drop the story and drop the narrative that you've attached to it, and you just come back to the energetic expression of the emotion in your physical body, then it allows you to be present with things without having to fix it. And I think that's really one of the most important steps in emotional health and emotional intelligence, is learning how to be present with something without needing to always do something about it.
I got you.
Can you be present with your anger or present with your shame or present with your grief, but not feel like you have to fix it in any way? Because usually the fixing it is our way of trying to wiggle our way out of it.
And
So
sort of
I think
times it's like you got this hedonic lifestyle where you've got to have pleasure and you've got to feel happy. You've got to have this dopamine hat. hits it. You got to have serotonin going through, and you got to have all these wonderful neurotransmitters so that you can feel good. But as soon as you're not feeling good, you want to resist those or suppress those. So now what you're saying is you've got to become mindful of those and aware of those and just sort of sit with them.
Yeah, I think what you can witness and observe and be present with without judgment of right or wrong or good or bad, that thing starts to heal immediately. When you bring present awareness without judgment to whatever that is inside of you, you can be fully present with it. I think that's what begins to heal. Like, for example, before we got on the podcast, whenever I do podcasts beforehand, my heart pounds a million miles an hour. My throat starts to lock up, tremendous like fear and anxiety. And I just sit presently with that energy. And I just bring my awareness into that part of my body. And I almost imagine it like one of my little children who's scared. And I just hold space with it. I'm present with it. I just let that energy know that I'm here. Because in reality, that energy is just an expression of my wounded child. It's an expression of my invisible child that, was always quiet and introverted and was bullied for never speaking and has a hard time expressing himself. So you go into a podcast and that becomes very fearful, very vulnerable for that part of me. But if I was just trying to fix that part of me, it would be like a parent just trying to fix the child without really being present with it, without holding space for it. So a lot of the emotional intelligence and emotional health really comes back to how we parent ourselves, how we hold space for ourselves, how we bring presence to ourselves without trying to fix ourselves. And I think that's really the key. And what you realize is the challenging ways or the stressful ways in which we engage our emotions usually are a mirror of one of the ways in which our parents engaged us. For example, I used to avoid my emotions at all costs because it didn't feel safe. Why? Because my dad was very emotionally disconnected. He was very like academic, very intellectual. He was a Western medicine like physician, and everything was kind of like physical world, but anything emotional, anything vulnerable, that wasn't allowed. So what I did as a survival mechanism was I disconnected from my emotions because that as a child in relationship to my father felt safe, right? It wasn't safe to be in my emotions. I had to disconnect from them, right? So I can stay connected to my father who was caring for my survival. He was putting food on the table, a roof over my head. So I started parenting my own emotions the way my dad parented me. And the healing process on an emotional level is to say, okay, what is the father that maybe I wanted but never received? Can I be that kind of parent to the emotions inside of me right now? Because each emotion is like a little child inside of you crying out for your attention. And it's not crying out to be fixed, it's crying out to be felt and just simply acknowledged.